Okay, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 14 on the brain and cranial nerves. So we got done with part 1 by talking about the midbrain, the encephalon, and now we're moving on to some other parts before we get to the cerebrum. So within the central region of the brain, there are parts that together is called our limbic system. So this whole area right here, the limbic system, which combines regions of the brain that acts as a motivation system that establish our emotional states, linking our conscious with unconscious functions, and facilitating memory storage and retrieval, and sometimes blending the two together where we can recall memory that can lead to certain emotions. So as part of the limbic system, the hippocampus here, which is this red region right here, that's the hippocampus, is a region important for learning, which is involved with storage and retrieval of new long-term memories. For example, while you're studying and trying to remember all these information for the upcoming lecture exam, you're trying your best to commit all these concepts and materials to memory. That is an example of utilizing your limbic system. Or even as simple as remembering what you ate yesterday for lunch, it can involve the hippocampus as well. And hence in Alzheimer's patients, which, they have problems with memory, this particular region of the limbic system is one of the earliest and most severely affected structure in the brain because it has to do with memory. Amygdaloid body here that looks like a little almond, they call it, amygdaloid for almond. This here plays a role in regulating your heart rate, responding to fear and anxiety, and control that fight or flight response. And they're able to relate and link those different effects with your emotions with specific memory. So, for example, if we are told a story that describes a scenery related to emotions of fear, we will link the emotion of fear with those specific memories, like, scary ghost stories in a dark, haunted place with, dark castle or something like that. Those moods and environment, why does that drive fear in us when we see that same scenery again? Is because we've been exposed to in our memory that, hey, all this little stuff within the environment is kind of scary, okay? Or if a child has been bitten by a dog before, the next time the child sees a dog, they will remember the incidents they had and spike fear in them. And different people can have different experience that can be associated with different emotions. Some people have very positive experience with dogs and adores dogs. So everyone's different based on the fact of our experiences and memories we have stored within the limbic system. And that's all we're going to go with the memories and limbic system. Won't go too much more into depth than that. And finally, we arrive at the cerebrum. It contains gray matter within the cerebral cortex. Okay, remember those folds of the brain here. And then you have those layers. And this layer there is that gray matter called the cerebral cortex. And basal nuclei is also a gray matter, okay, while white matter of the cerebrum will lie deep to the cerebral cortex. So these areas are usually where you have white matter, okay, but the cerebrum, as we have mentioned, is where all conscious thoughts and intellectual functions originate, and then we will need to send those out in commands, okay? Now, remember that white matter stems from myelinated axons of neurons. So these are what's interconnecting and permitting in communication within or between cerebral hemispheres and other regions of the brain, respectively. So, for example, we talked that you have to identify the area called the corpus callosum within the brain. So if this was a cut sagittal section of the brain, you'll see this section right here that kind of looks like that. and inside is the thalamus. So this region right there is the corpus callosum. And when we do this in actual lab, we actually dissect a sheep brain, and you will be able to see that the corpus callosum appears in that whitish color is because it is made up of white matter, or those white matter axons, for relaying information in form of action potentials or electrical impulses that will carry the information towards different parts of the brain, or for left and right hemispheres to stay in communication with each other. So that's why when you cut the brain down the longitudinal fissure, you're going to end up cutting the corpus callosum in half, is because that is the location of the cerebrum where it connects the two halves, two left and right hemispheres. Okay. Okay, so the basal nuclei is this region here within the central part of the brain. It is involved with subconscious control of skeletal muscle tone and coordination of learned movement patterns and rhythm. So, for example, when you walk, okay, we tend to swing our arms in rhythm. And the fact that we know how to swing our arms in those cycles, so that it kind of coordinates with how our thighs and legs are moving when we walk, so that we stay in balance while we walk. All that pattern and rhythm also has a role by your basal nuclei in order to set those patterns and rhythm and know what to do with your control of skeletal muscles as you're walking or running, etc. Now, and hence the activity of the basal nuclei is inhibited by the neurotransmitter dopamine to produce smooth movement. Remember, I talked about you need inhibition for smooth movements, and dopamine has that inhibition activity. Kind of like what I was talking about with GABA released from Purkinje cells in the cerebellum. You can't just have excitation, but there needs to be signals that inhibit some things from moving so you can produce a controlled movement. So if one has low levels of dopamine, that will result in a more active basal nuclei, and that can result in more rigidity. And hence this can lead to difficulty to even start any voluntary movement due to the opposing muscles not being able to relax. So that's why we're talking about those. I was talking about those antagonistic muscles, which are the opposing muscles that has to relax in order for your prime mover of the muscle or protagonist muscles to contract and result in a smooth movement. If the antagonist muscle doesn't relax, the other muscle can't contract correctly. So that's the case in what happens with people with Parkinson's disease, is that they don't have enough dopamine, results in a more active basal nuclei, and which then results in more rigidity. Okay, so the rest of the cerebrum can be divided into their specific lobes and cortexes. The frontal lobe here, this portion right here, is the frontal lobe, and it's easy to remember these lobes is because they coincide with the positions of the cranial bones. Remember, we talked about frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, temporal bone. Well, same thing. You have lobes that corresponds with those areas of the skull bone. And so the frontal bone right here is in charge of voluntary control of skeletal muscles. Parietal lobe here is for conscious conception of touch, pressure, pain, vibration, taste, and temperature. It's kind of that main area where sensory information will arrive at is your parietal lobe. And then you have occipital lobe, which is mainly for conscious perception of visual stimuli. So all those other senses that is not related to vision is for parietal, and then the temporal lobe is for the other type of sensory information. Temporal lobe right here. Temporal lobe right there is for perception of auditory and olfactory stimuli. And you can kind of remember it easily by where these things are situated. For example, the occipital lobe is in the back of the brain, where your eyes are right here in front of your head, and it has that optic nerve that goes all the way back to the back of the brain. So that's why this area is for visual information. Well, temporal lobe is on the side of your face or lateral sides of your face, and that's where your ears are. So that's why temporal lobe has to do with auditory, and it's kind of close to your nose here in the front of them, in the interior portion of the temporal lobe. So that's why it has to do with your olfactory stimuli. And within each cerebral lobe, there are more specific regions called cortexes that perform main tasks. For example, primary motor cortex is this part of the frontal lobe, okay? Primary motor cortex. And it controls skeletal muscles, and this particular region of the frontal lobe contains specific type of neurons called pyramidal cells that can direct voluntary movement by controlling those somatic motor neurons we talked about in the neuromuscular junction from the brainstem and the spinal cord. So that's why you have these particular cortex areas specializing in their main function. The primary somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe here, this blue region right here within the parietal lobe, is one of the sensory areas of the brain where neurons will receive all general somatic sensory information. Everything that is coming in as a signal, what we talked about here, touch, pressure, pain, vibration, taste, and temperature, is coming through towards this primary somatosensory cortex. And it makes sense because the thalamus sits right in the middle center of the cerebrum, coming up from the rest of the diencephalon and the midbrain. So that it only makes sense that information travels straight up from the thalamus into this area right away, synapsing on this particular cortex to give the brain that sense of that you're feeling hot, you're feeling pain. So right away, then you will do something in response to that. Okay. All right. And then you have these other individual cortexes for your special senses of the body. You have visual, auditory, olfactory, and gustatory cortex. So gustatory means taste. Okay, everything else sounds pretty straightforward. Olfactory is for smell. And of course, visual and auditory is very straightforward. So here's your visual cortex within the occipital lobe for receiving that information from your eyes. And then you have your gustatory cortex right here, this purple area, that is for receiving information about taste. And we'll talk about two cranial nerves that is important for sending those sensory information of taste from your tongue towards your brain in this area. And then you have your olfactory cortex, which is this pink region right here within the temporal lobe. And then the auditory cortex, this yellow region here within the temporal lobe, that is for receiving information about sound. And of course, olfactory cortex for receiving this information about smell. Now, in addition to cortexes, there are what's called association areas that is responsible for interpreting incoming data and coordinate a motor response. Okay, so that's why I said the brain is a super complicated organ, because there's these nuclei, there's these lobes, and now cortexes, and now you have these association areas. And that's the whole point of the brain, is because it is enabling you to do all these really complex stuff that requires multiple parts of the brain. And, for example, the somatosensory association cortex, which is located within the parietal lobe here. So this whole light blue area is the somatosensory association cortex. This area is what enables you to recognize different touches. For example, that ants is crawling on your skin, or something as light as a mosquito landing on your arm, and you feel that mosquito on your arm and you act and respond and slap on that area on your skin, versus for sure is not something hitting you with a soccer ball on your skin. Okay, so the fact that you can tell the difference between these different touches and relate it to right away, okay, that's a soccer ball hitting my skin. Who just hit my back, okay? Or versus a bug, a cockroach, or a little, ants crawling on your skin. You know that there's some bug crawling on you, and you'll look in response. So the fact that we know these differences and associate them to different organisms or different sources of touches is because we have this somatosensory association cortex that tells us and coordinates those data together. The other example is your visual association area. Visual association area, if you look back on this slide here, is this region, visual association area within the occipital lobe. This part of the occipital lobe is not just allowing you to see letters, okay? For example, you see letters on the screen, okay? But the fact that you can combine these letters very quickly in form of word, for example, the fact that C, A, and R can combine to a word car, and you can do that very, very quickly within seconds, is because your visual association area is enabling you to associate these letters together into a word that makes some sort of sense or have meaning to them. Okay. And then last example, you have premotor cortex, which is what coordinates learned movement. Remember, premotor cortex is in the frontal lobe, which is in charge of controlling your skeletal muscle movements. So premotor cortex residing in the frontal lobe is for coordinating that learned movement and store them as a pattern for smooth performance, such as moving your eyes as you read lines. Now, this is different from learning a skill. Okay, so that's cerebellum we're talking about, learning how to ride a bike, learning how to play piano. But, premotor cortex is what controls skeletal muscles that help you to do those patterns. Okay, so it's kind of like, working together for that one capability of the brain. Okay, so you're able to move your eyes, in that horizontal pattern so that you don't miss a line or skip to the next paragraph all of a sudden as you're reading some reading material from a book or from a slide. Okay. All right. Now, to make things even more complex in the brain, other than these association areas, there's what we call specific integration centers that are responsible for receiving information from many association areas, and they are for directing extremely complex motor activities and analytical functions. Now, there are many integrative centers, but we're just going to mention two here because we don't want to get too complicated with too many things for you to know for this chapter. So, for example, there are two very specialized language areas in the cerebrum. One is called the Wernicke's area, which is associated with your ability to comprehend language. Now, in order for us to say a paragraph or even a sentence that makes sense, we have to have a functional Wernicke's area, which is this area right here that you can see kind of overlaps between different lobes and different areas of the brain. And if an individual have damage to this specific area of the brain, for example, in a stroke or something, and that particular stroke was affecting the Wernicke's area, then when they recover from the stroke, they will be able to form words, but they will combine words that don't make sense together because now they lose the ability for comprehension of the language. You may ask them, "How are you?" or "What did you do today?" And they may end up answering, "You're pretty," or "Oh, well, there's water over there." It's just words that comes up in their brain, but yet they may not answer your question in context, or they may not even make a whole sentence at all, but there will be a whole gibberish of words coming out of that person's mouth, but they have no meaning in them. Okay. So people with problems in Wernicke's area will have no difficulty finding words in their brain, but they don't have meaning to them. That is answering the context of a particular question. And you can even look up some YouTube videos of example patients that are speaking with either damage to the Wernicke's area or the Broca's area. And they're called aphasia because they lose the ability to speak in a certain way after a stroke. Okay, so the other integration center for language is called the Broca's area, which is this yellow region right here. In that area. So Broca's area is associated with speech production. So in order for us to speak what we want to say and form words, this area of the brain has to work properly. So if an individual have a damaged Broca's area, they end up not being able to find the right words to express what they want to say. For example, if you ask a patient that has damaged area of the front in the Broca's area, and if you ask them, what did you do for what do you do for work? They may have to think for a few seconds to say a first word like work, then think a little bit more, then able to form a couple more words at a desk, and then think a bit more, and they will say sales. So, for a person with damaged Broca area, they have to think a long time to find the right word to express what they want to express. And a lot of times they're choppy and they may not form a whole sentence. A normal person can easily say, I work as a sales sitting at a desk every day, in whole sentence without pause and very quickly within seconds. But for people with Broca's area, they can only form single words, okay? And it may take some time for them to recall those words to express what they want to talk about. All right, so the prefrontal cortex is something I want to talk about because this is a special area that is, of course, the anterior part of the frontal lobe, and it coordinates information relayed from all cortical association areas. And this is what enables us to form abstract intellectual function, such as predicting consequences of actions or events, or even to tell time. The fact that we know what difference between minutes and days, or something is due next week Tuesday, and we know just about when that is, that's because we have a functional prefrontal cortex. An example that's more applicable now is the fact that we know if this assignment is not done by tonight, for example, in terms of consequences, then no points will be given for that assignment is a result of our prefrontal cortex, that we know if we don't do this, this is going to happen. This prediction of consequences that results if I study hard, if I spend the time, if I do this and that, I know I'm going to get a good grade. Okay, so these are things that are able to be predicted by a functional prefrontal cortex. And interestingly, this part of the brain function is not fully developed until the early 20s of age, which explains why a lot of times younger teenagers or children may participate in what adults may think as irrational actions. Why would they do that? That's going to cause this and this to happen. Kind of like that skull prank earlier that was happening all over YouTube or TikTok or something, where they were pulling pranks on their friends, and they would kick them while they're trying to jump. And that person would land flat on the back of their head and can cause a concussion. That is a very, very serious consequence for a prank like that. So, adults would think, why do they do that? Okay, well, it's not giving them an excuse, but it's part of developmental thing that they have to go through. And of course, that's why we have to give them consequence, and we have to give them reminders and reminders and reminders. That's whole part of parenting and teaching children is getting them to learn the consequences. For example, when my son was only 2 years old, I would tell him all day long to not do this one thing, like slamming the door, or don't eat old cookie crumbs off the floor. And we know as adults, those actions may lead to bad consequences. Smashing your fingers on the door, or getting a stomach ache, or you might vomit because of germs that's on the old cookies. But yet, a 2-year-old child, you can tell them, don't eat that right in front of them. And the next second, they will turn around and pick it right up and put it in their mouth. Okay. Well, that part of knowing, doing certain things result in bad consequences takes time to grow and develop into, which is why we need to be patient as parents and teachers and instructors that, sometimes we need to get that pattern going to allow children to learn and adapt and develop this particular part of their brain that they know that if they do something, this is going to happen. Okay. So that's why we have to keep reminding and reminding and reminding, sounding like a broken record all the time as parents. And unfortunately, even though prefrontal cortex sounds like it's a good idea, sometimes being over worried about consequences can also produce feelings of frustration, tension, and anxiety about possible upcoming events or consequences that are just too much, too over worry and too exaggerated. So this is the negative effect of the prefrontal cortex. For example, there are those individuals with anxiety problems and have anxiety attacks that may have to rely on medications to control their feelings every day. Maybe a change in schedule or sudden change in environment is going to make them go into that anxiety panic attack, and they become non-functional. So there are some of these things that are, sort of the negative consequence of the frontal cortex as well. And this understanding of the prefrontal cortex led to a pretty bizarre medical procedure they used to perform during middle of the 20th century for patients with mental illnesses, particularly those associated with violent and antisocial behavior. Now, this is what I mean by we humans learn from our mistakes, and we are constantly modifying our hypotheses and procedures to help better our skills and be able to better treat patients with different types of diseases. And this particular bizarre medical procedure is called a prefrontal lobotomy. If you know what lobotomy means, you kind of get the idea of what this is about. So what happens with prefrontal lobotomy is just like this picture right here, where an instrument that looks like this, kind of like a needle, is inserted under the eyelids that way and goes straight through to the prefrontal cortex. That's where the prefrontal cortex is. And it will wiggle around to sever the prefrontal cortex, thus making that part of the brain non-functional. Well, according to what they used to think, that prefrontal cortex is just for consequences. Well, if they don't have those anxiety problems, they don't have those emotions associated with consequences, then this person won't have these mental illnesses anymore that gives them those violent or antisocial behavior. And, we can remove those scary feelings away from these individuals. Well, you can imagine what can be bizarre about that is because yes, patients are no longer concerned with their major problems such as hallucinations or physical pain, but they are also unconcerned about decorum, meaning how they're dressed, how they look like on the outside, or even toilet training. Well, I can pee right here on the ground or poop on the ground in public because I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't see the consequences about that. Or walk out naked because I want to. There's no consequences with that. I'm not thinking about that. Right now I want to go wear my I don't want to wear any clothes and go outside, So that's what happened with these prefrontal lobotomy patients, is that they stop caring about everything because now you're removing all of that consequential feeling and intellectual function that is supposed to be the part of our brain. And of course, I'm sure there's other things that were gone too from when you remove the prefrontal cortex. And you can't just remove a part of the brain and be able to function normally. Now, this is different from, what you've heard about people living with half a brain. That's usually when the brain is in their childhood stage, where the brain is still growing and developing, and they can actually allow reworking of the neurons so they can only function with half a brain. But we're talking about adults here that's already with a developed brain, and you don't want to remove parts of the brain from an adult, okay? And of course, this prefrontal lobotomy is no longer practiced, and we now have drugs that target specific pathway and regions of the central nervous system that can help with those things, okay? Kind of like what we talked about with the serotonin drugs, okay? Medications. Now, because the brain is made up of neurons, and the thing neurons do is conduct electrical impulses, we can actually measure those electrical impulses with electrodes to monitor brain activity. This measurement is called the EEG, or electroencephalogram. Now, don't confuse this with ECG, which is monitoring electrical impulses of the heart to look at cardiac activity. We will look at parts of the ECG next semester when we talk about the heart, but now we're on the brain, so this is EEG, okay? And there are 4 main types of brain waves that can be read from EEG. Alpha waves are those that are observed from healthy, awake adults resting with your eyes closed. This is when you're in your hum moments, okay, where you're just resting, relaxing, not really thinking about anything, not worrying about the lecture exam coming up. You're just in that peaceful moment, okay? Okay, so this is what happens, that will show up as alpha waves on the EEG. Now, they will disappear during sleep or concentration, because when we sleep, we will dream, and dreams will not give you that peaceful moment. A lot of dreams can be bizarre, good or bad kind of bizarre, going to an amusement park or whatever it is, some are joyful, some are scary, so those are when the alpha waves will go away when a person sleeps. Okay, so beta waves are higher frequency brain waves that happens when a person is concentrating on a task, under stress, or in some state of psychological tension. Okay, so that's why you have these more higher frequency waves closer together instead of these nice alpha waves here. So whenever, for example, if you're cramming and studying really hard and stressed about things coming up, about everything in your life, you will, if you measure your EEG at that moment, you will see a lot of these beta waves coming through. And then you have third type of waves called theta waves, which is most often observed in children, but in adults, this is not normal. It usually exists in intensely frustrated adults, or it may actually indicate presence of a brain disorder such as a tumor. So that's why when patients have brain tumor, before they, we don't go for an MRI scan of our brain all of a sudden, but sometimes you will see an individual all of a sudden changing in their anger management or emotions or temper. And sometimes that can be a sign of a tumor that's growing in their brain that's interrupting the normal processes and electrical conduction of the brain, that it can produce these theta waves. So that's a good sign of something going wrong with the brain. And lastly, delta waves are these large magnitude and low frequency waves. Now, what's normal is only in infants, okay? When a baby is in its deep sleep pattern, or awake infants, okay? That's what we see in delta wave, okay? Or in adults as well. So for adults that are in deep sleep or awake infants, you will see these delta waves. But if this is seen in an awake adult, this can definitely mean something wrong. Either a tumor, there's vascular blockage that will eventually lead to a stroke or a TIA, or inflammation of damaged parts of the brain. That's what delta waves can indicate. Okay, so without cutting up someone's brain open or having to do an MRI scan, EEG can also provide some insight as to what's going on in the brain. And a common brain disorder activity that can be seen on EEG is seizures. Now, a seizure is a temporary cerebral disorder that is accompanied usually by abnormal movements, unusual sensations, or inappropriate behavior, or a combination of these, sometimes known as epilepsy. And here is a diagram of a seizure-free EEG and someone undergoing epileptic seizure EEG. You see all these brain waves in very, very high frequency and very, very high magnitude as well. That means there are multiple places in the brain that's firing all at the same time, inappropriately together. And signs and symptoms of seizures depend on the area of the brain that's affected. For example, if it affects primary motor cortex, then odd movements can occur when that person is experiencing seizure in that particular area. Maybe all of a sudden it twitches head or move its arm upwards out of nowhere. Or if it affects the auditory cortex, this is how patients can hear strange sounds. So, where for patients with hallucinations or they think they hear these sounds that nobody else can hear, it can mean a seizure that's happening within the auditory cortex area, because now there's just all these action potential that's firing out of nowhere all of a sudden in high magnitude and in multiple of them together, that's causing all these different things to happen within the brain depending where it's activated. All right, so, and the last topic of this chapter is the 12 cranial nerves we have in our brain that innervates different parts of the body for different functions. You have to identify these 12 cranial nerves in lab, but there are 2 sets of mnemonics that can help you remember the order and names of the cranial nerves and their functional classification. So, functional classification of cranial nerves is either it is sensory, meaning it is special senses that's coming through, that is innervating or providing information about. And it can be motor, which means is movement, that is, being able to send out the commands for certain places as movements, location of the body's movement. And then the third type of functional classification is both, meaning a mixture of both sensory and motor. Okay, so let me write that down. So functional classification of cranial nerve can be sensory, or also what they call, we'll leave it as sensory. It's easier that way. Sensory, motor. Okay, so S for sensory, M for motor, and then you have both. Okay, or pretty much meaning mixed, some sensory and some motor. So sensory or motor. All right, so the mnemonic for remembering the order of the cranial nerves, the 12 cranial nerves by name, is either of these 2, this one or this one. But it's up to you which one you want to use. But for me, I have a hard time remembering these 2 mnemonics myself, that I just remember the order of the locations of these 12 cranial nerves on the brain. To me, that was easier than trying to remember that mnemonic. But I'll go through this in case this works out for you. Kind of like that come let's get sunburn for integumentary system. So the mnemonic goes, oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. So those words has to do with the first letter of the cranial nerve. Oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. I don't know why they switched the order of these 2. Probably because of the location. But yeah, 11 comes first, then 12. Okay, or the other way. To touch and feel very green vegetables are heaven. Okay, so either of these 2 will help you, if it's applicable to you and you find it helpful, it will help you remember the order of the cranial nerves and what letter they start with. Now, this second one actually got stuck in my brain. Okay, I remembered it once. I have it committed to memory. Now I'll never forget the order of sensory versus motor and both for the order of the cranial nerves. So if we go down in order from cranial nerve 1 to cranial nerve 12, this first letter of these words is what tells me whether it is a sensory cranial nerve, a motor cranial nerve, or a mixture cranial nerve, a bit of both. So some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matters more. So some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matters more. Okay, so that going down to 12 cranial nerves, you know which is for sensory, which is for motor, which one has both. Okay, so those are the mnemonics that will help you. Now, I'll go over these 12 cranial nerves pretty quickly on their main function, and for some of them, I'll talk about diseases associated with that particular cranial nerve, and then we'll be done with chapter 14. Okay, so olfactory nerve is the first cranial nerve that sits right here, and it is sensory cranial nerve for the sense of smell. And the origin of the cranial nerve are these olfactory epithelium receptors at the ends of these nerves. And then you have the destination is the actual olfactory bulb right here in this region. Now, this is the only cranial nerve that is directly attached to the cerebrum. So it goes in one synapse from on the cranial nerve towards your cerebrum in the olfactory cortex, okay, in the temporal lobe. Cranial nerve 2 are optic nerve, which is for vision, and also a sensory type of cranial nerve. The origin comes from retina. So retina is in the back of the eyes, and we'll talk about that in chapter 17, how there's different neurons that collect together in form of an optic nerve that comes back towards the thalamus within what's called the optic chiasm, which then sends the information towards opposite sides of the brain in the occipital lobe, the visual cortex of the occipital lobe. And then that's why they say that what the information coming in from your right eye actually go to your left brain, whereas information coming in from your left eye goes into your right brain. And then the 3 nerves here are associated with eye movements, okay? And I'm not going to be very typical about, okay, which direction of movement or which particular eye muscle is this particular cranial nerve innervating, okay? I know AMP is a lot of information already, so I'm not going to require all those other details things, okay? So all 3 of these cranial nerves, oculomotor, cranial nerve 3, trochlear, cranial nerve 4, and abducen, cranial nerve 6. These 3 cranial nerves are all for eye movements, and hence they are all motor cranial nerves. Okay, that's all you have to remember for their function is the eye movement, and remember their names, of course. And they're all innervating these muscles, 6 muscles of the eye that gives you different eye movement, allowing you to look to the side, look up, look down, etc. Now, if you have damage to oculomotor nerve, you may have pain over the eyes or experience droopy eyelids and even double vision. When you have damage to the trochlear nerve, you may have difficulty looking down and to the side. And abducens, it's kind of named for that movement of the eye, which is abduction of the eye, allowing the eye to look to the side. So that's why it's called abducens. Trigeminal nerve is the 5th cranial nerve that innervates the face, and they are your both nerve, which means it has both sensory and motor function. So it has sensory information coming from your skin of your face, that you can feel someone touching your face, for example, or your maxillary and mandibular area, and hence Tic de la Rue is a disease where you have constant pain in the maxillary and mandibular area, and it is usually triggered by contact with your lips, tongue, and gums, which is what this whole trigeminal nerve is innervating, all these different parts of the face, okay? And why it is motor is because it has to do with your mastication muscles for chewing. So the motor portion of the trigeminal nerve is what allows you to move your jaws. And then cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. As the name suggests, facial. So it is for the face. Again, both sensory and motor. Now, but not the same facial portion as the trigeminal nerve, okay? Facial nerve innervates the lacrimal glands, nasal glands, and also facial expression, okay? This is feeling sensory information coming from your skin. This is allowing you to do, to cry, to have mucus, have mucus things coming out from your nose, and also forming facial expression in the face. So that's why it's sensory and motor, because it's what allows you to smile, for example, or grunt and make an angry face, etc. Now, Bell's palsy is a disease when you have inflammation, particularly in this facial nerve. Usually, it is a viral pathogen that leads to Bell's palsy, and it can lead to facial muscles paralysis and loss of taste. Where you don't feel anything on your face, and you can start to drool as well, because then you don't have any feeling on your face when you have Bell's palsy. Now, the sensory portion of the facial nerve has to do with the taste receptors in the anterior 2/3 of your tongue. Okay, so some of it is going towards the tongue, so you can sense that, taste coming through, sweet, bitter, whatever it is. Okay, so facial nerve is motor in a sense for those facial expression, sensory in a sense for taste sensations. The vestibulocochlear nerve is your 8th cranial nerve, and is very straightforward by name what it does. Vestibule is this part of the inner ear. We'll talk about the structure of your middle ear or an internal ear when we get to Chapter 17 on special senses, but this part is called the vestibule. This part is the cochlea. Okay, vestibule is for your ability to balance and equilibrium, whereas your cochlea is for hearing. So that's why this vestibulocochlear nerve is innervating your vestibule part of your inner ear and cochlea part of your inner ear. This is the cranial nerve 8. Vestibulocochlear nerve, which then diverges into the 2 organs of the inner ears. Okay, so it's for hearing and balance and equilibrium. So that's why cranial nerve 8 is a sensory type of cranial nerve. Cranial nerve 9 is called a glossopharyngeal nerve, and it is a mixture of both sensory and motor. Sensory has to do with the tongue's posterior third of reception of taste, and then motor has to do with your movement of your pharynx, palate, those muscles of the neck. So pharyngeal muscles for swallowing comes into play when we can no longer swallow. Maybe something's wrong with the glossopharyngeal nerve. Vagus nerve is the most widely distributed cranial nerve because it goes all the way from the brain towards your neck, thoracic cavity, and abdominal cavity. So that's how long all the whole vagus nerve is, and that's why it has all these different organs, because it innervates the diaphragm, innervates the abdominal cavities organs, thoracic cavity organs, and hence that's why it controls a lot of different stuff that has to do with your digestion, respiration, and cardiovascular functions, including also swallowing. So that's why usually when a patient have difficulty swallowing, it could be either cranial nerve 9 or cranial nerve 10 that is malfunctioning. And your last two cranial nerves, accessory nerve and hypoglossal nerve. Accessory nerve is cranial nerve 11, which is mainly motor for innervating muscles of your neck and upper back, including your shoulders, which allows you to shrug your shoulders or turn your neck. So I like to remember as accessory like necklaces. So if you have a necklace, then it is something to do with your neck muscles. So accessory brings me the thought of necklace, which means is movement of my neck. And then hypoglossal nerve has to do with also motor, but just mainly your tongue movement. Okay, so this is your hypoglossal nerve right here, innervating muscles of your tongue for moving your tongue. And conditions of this nerve can be checked by sticking out your tongue. And that's why, as part of routine checkup, doctors will ask you to stick out your tongue and also look under in your throat as well, of course. But sticking out your tongue, if your tongue is not naturally in the middle of your head, then something is wrong, because that's what allows your tongue movement to be correct. And hence, if something's damaged within the hypoglossal nerve, your tongue tend to veer towards the affected side of the nerve. Okay, will either veer left or right, depending which side of the hypoglossal nerve is where damage is happening. Okay. All right, so that's all we have for chapter 14, and let's go over the practice questions and we'll be done. How would decreased diffusion across the arachnoid granulation affect the volume of cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricle? Volume will increase because, remember, arachnoid granulation is for drainage or reabsorption of CSF. If you have blockage there or not enough fluid go through there, then you have fluid buildup within the ventricles. After suffering a stroke, a patient is unable to speak, but can understand what is said to him and can understand written messages. So which part of his brain is affected by the stroke? The Broca's area. They can't speak, they can't form words, but they are able to do comprehension. And then, so Wernicke's area is the opposite effect. They can speak, form words, but they don't mean anything. What symptoms would you expect to observe in an individual who has damage to the basal nuclei? Difficulty starting voluntary movement and decreased muscle tone, which is the function of the basal nuclei. Under more extreme conditions, patients may elect to have surgical transection of the corpus callosum to control epileptic seizure. This will lead to, remember what corpus callosum do? A disconnection between left and right hemisphere. That's the whole point of corpus callosum, is those white matter axons connecting the two hemispheres together. Conscious perception of which senses will be affected by damage to the temporal lobes of the cerebrum? Temporal lobe, what are they in charge of? Olfactory and auditory information. The superior colliculus is a what reflex center, whereas the inferior is a what reflex center. Remember, superior for eyes, inferior for ears. So it is visual and auditory within the midbrain, the tectum of the midbrain. What brain regions make up the brainstem? You have midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Cerebellum is off to the side on the bottom of the cerebrum right here. That's a cerebellum, and then this whole part is the midbrain. Is the brainstem, excuse me. Okay, and then the diencephalon up here in the central region of the cerebrum. A person's EEG during deep sleep will resemble that of someone who is awake but has a brain tumor. So in adult deep sleep, you would have delta waves, okay? But it also is the same as a person who was awake with a brain tumor. Many water-soluble molecules that are relatively abundant in blood occur in small amounts or not at all in extracellular fluid in the brain. Why? Blood-brain barrier restricts ion movement. Whole point of blood-brain barrier. What is the primary function of cerebellum? It is coordinating that rapid automatic adjustment to maintain balance and equilibrium, and also for learning a new skill, for example, that we talked about. A patient who is hooked up to an EEG shows primarily beta waves. What is she doing? beta, so she is concentrating on a specific task. Not extremely frustrated, maybe somewhat frustrated, but not a little bit stressed. But extremely frustrated adults would have theta waves instead. Which of the following statements is not true with regard to the cranial dura mater and spinal dura mater? In spinal column, it contains dural sinuses, and that is false. Okay, that is something we didn't talk about yet, but we'll talk about in chapter 13 when we get to the spinal cord. But the brain, dura mater is composed of 2 layers, and some part of it does go into as dura folds, those falx cerebelli and cerebelli, and falx cerebri is what we talked about. Okay, and there's no epidural space in the brain. The substantia nigra is a nucleus that secretes neurotransmitter dopamine. So this portion has to do with Parkinson's disease. Which structure associated with diencephalon is responsible for secretion of melatonin that regulates day and night cycles, your circadian rhythm, your pineal gland? Okay, and that's all I have. Those are actually deleted slides from before because this chapter is just so complicated. I've narrowed it down in some, to somewhat doable chapter. Okay, all right. See you